Welcome to lecture 10 of Python module, and in this video we will talk about object-oriented programming. So Python supports functional and procedural programming language, and so it supports object-oriented programming as well. So it's a paradigm that uses objects and classes, and it aims to implement real-world entities like inheritance, polymorphism, encapsulation. The main concept of OOP is to bind the data and function that work on together as a single unit so that no other part of code can access this data. The OOP concepts in Python involve class, object, inheritance, encapsulation, polymorphism, and abstraction. So basically, class and objects are the basics of OOP, while abstraction, polymorphism, encapsulation, and inheritance are the four pillars of OOP. So in this part 1, we will talk about class and object, while in part 2, we will talk about the pillar of OOP. So let's begin. An object is any entity that has attribute and behavior. For example, a parrot is an object in a real world. So it has certain properties associated to it. For example, its name, age, color, that will be termed as an attribute. And that parrot can perform certain actions, for example, dancing and singing. So this will be termed as its behavior. So a class is a blueprint for that object. Remember this line. For example, we have a blueprint of a house. Using that blueprint, you can create a real object that is house. But it's not important that you create only one object. Using that blueprint, you can actually create thousands of houses and that too of different color, different interior designing and etc. So that's the difference between class and object. Class is a blueprint and object is a real entity which is based on the class, right? So a class is actually a user-defined data structure. It holds its own members and function, and it can be accessed and used by creating an instance of that class. So you cannot access class itself because it's nothing but an idea or a blueprint. So to use a function or member, you need to create an object, a real entity, and that is termed as an instance. So whenever I will be speaking instance, it means object. Both are same, right? So let's see an example of creating a class. So we will be using a keyword class. Then we will write the name of a class and then colon. So that is a simple syntax. While how to create the object of that class, you will be writing the object name. And then after equals to, you will be writing the class name and then parenthesis. So this is how you create an object of class. After creating an object, you can access all its function and variable. Now let's understand what's an object. An object is an instance of a class. A class is a blueprint, but instance is a copy of a class with actual value. And when I'm saying instance, it is actually object. So object has three things. One is its name, through which we will identify, and then it has attribute and behavior. Attribute is termed as a variable in OOP, and behavior is termed as function, and more particularly method in OOP. So now let's see how to instantiate a class. When an object of a class is created, the class is said to be instantiated. So a class is a blueprint, but when you use that blueprint using an object for the first time, it is known as instantiating a class. All the instances share the attribute and the behavior of a class, but the value of those attribute or the state are unique for each object. A single class may have any number of instances. As said before, using one blueprint, you can create n number of houses. Similarly, using one class, you can create any number of instances or object. However, each object will have the attribute and behavior of a class, but then the value of those attributes will be unique to each object. So to understand it more clearly, let's see an example. In this example, we define a class called player. The init method is used to initialize the attribute name, health, and score for each player object, and the display detail method display the player's information, including its name, health, and score. And then finally, the attack method stimulates the player attacking. Now we have created two player objects, player 1 and player 2, with their respective attribute. Finally, we will be using display detail method to display the detail of each player, and then we will call the attack method for player 1 to stimulate an attack. Now let's deep dive into the each line of this code. Now one thing, init and self is very specific to OOP. We will understand what it is in a while. But for now, just understand that init is a method, and inside this self actually point towards the object. So basically when I'm creating player object, self is pointing towards player 1, and then it says that player 1 name is Alice, player 1 health is 100, and player 1 score is 50. So init has 4 parameters, but when I'm calling the player 1 object, I'm only passing 3 parameters, because at the back of this code, the 4th parameter is actually player 1. So this is just a method of writing it. Similarly, player 2 is my first parameter of init, which says that self is my player 2, and player 2 name is Bob, its health is 80, and its score is 70. Now, once I have created the object of a class, I am eligible to use its method. So using the object player 1, I am using method display detail to display Alice details. Similarly, I am using player 2 object to display the details of Bob. And then finally, I'm using attack method using player 1 object to display that Alice is attacking. So now in this example, what you have to notice is that using a class, I cannot directly access the method. For that, I have created an object, and every object has its own specific attribute. Okay, so in the previous example, we saw init method. So what it is? So it's a special method in Python classes that is automatically called when an object of a class is created. So it is used to initialize the attribute, as the name suggests. Init means initialize, and the one thing to remember is that it is automatically called, and it is used to initialize the attribute. And this method is also known as a constructor. So whether I'm saying init method or a constructor, it means the same. It is automatically called and is used to initialize the attribute. So here you can see that it has 4 parameters, where the first parameter defines that it will be called, this method will be called on an object self. Now self can be anything like player 1 and player 2 in our previous example. And then it has 3 attributes, name, health, and score. So basically using the object self, I will be using attribute name to assign parameter name. Repeating it again, that I will be using object to assign name parameter to name attribute. And similarly for health and score. So that's the function of init. And now you know what's self. Self is actually a convention. It's not a keyword, and it is used as a first parameter in the instance method of a class. It is referred to as an instance of a class, and as told earlier, instance is nothing but object. So self refers to an object. So when an instance method is called on an object, the object itself is automatically passed as the first argument to the method. By convention, this first parameter is named self, although you can use any valid variable name. Instead of self, you can actually write player or game, person, anything. So it's just a convention which point towards the current object. Okay. So now you know the relation between object and class, and what's an init method and what's a self. Now one of the most important statement which I haven't said till now is that everything in Python is an object, including built-in type like string, int, list, etc. For example, here we have created 3 variables, name, age, and numbers, and each variable is assigned to a value. For example, name is assigned to Alice string, age is assigned to integer 25, and number is assigned to a list. Now when I'm printing the type of every variable using the type method, I can see that in the output I am getting class str, which says that the string object is an object of class str. Similarly, integer object is an object of class int, and list object is an object of class list. So everything in Python is an object, and for object we first need to create a class, and we have a lot of built-in objects classes as well, which we were using earlier, right? Now, another thing which you need to know is that to call method inside a class using object, there are two ways. One thing is clear that to use method, it's important to create an object. But there are two ways of calling method. One is to write the class name dot, then you write the method name, and inside the parenthesis you write the object name as we write inside the class. So inside the function, self is the parameter, and what is self? It is pointing towards the object. So inside my class dot my method, I am passing the object name. But then the more common and frequent method of calling method is by creating object of a class, and then with the help of an object we can call the method. Now why this is not throwing us any error and why this is a valid syntax? Because first we are creating object of a class, my class. So now I know whenever I'm calling object dot my method, since object is an object of my class, so I am calling a function of my class. So this is how it is getting mapped. Okay, so now let's understand what are the various type of variable in OOP. So there are two types, instance and class variable. So instance variable are unique to each instance of a class. Instance means object. So variable which are unique to every object is known as an instance variable, and they hold data that vary from one object to another. For example, we see in the previous example that every player has its own name, score and health, right? So each object has its own copy of instance variable. So for example, here we will be using init method. Why? Because it is getting called automatically and it is used, this is also known as a constructor by the way, and it is used to write the variable, or we can say attribute of an object. Okay, and for that we use self dot attribute is equals to the parameter. This is how we do it. So, for example, we were talking about the instance variable. So I have a class circle and inside that I have a method init. Now I'm creating two objects for the circle, and inside a circle I have to pass two parameters. Now self is getting mapped to circle 1 and radius is getting mapped with 5. Similarly for circle 2, self is getting mapped to circle 2 and radius is getting mapped to 10. So when I am printing circle 1 radius, which is variable, and when I'm printing circle 2 radius, you can see that the output are different depending upon the object. So it is unique to each instance, and therefore this is known as an instance variable. Now let's see what's a class variable. So as the name suggests that this is not unique to an instance or object, instead it is for the class. So class variable are shared among all the instances of a class and they are defined within the class but outside any instance method. Changes to class variable are reflected in all the instances of class. So instance variable is unique to each object, while class variable is common to all the objects. For example, here inside the circle class, I am creating a class variable pi. Now whatever object I create like circle 1, circle 2 or circle 100, whenever I will print pi value, it will always return me the same value. Why? Because it is a common sharing between all the objects of class circle. Now, if you know the type of variable, we have different type of methods as well. So we have two type of variable, instance and class. Similarly, we have three type of method, instance, class and static. Let's see one by one what are they. Instance method are defined within a class and operate on instance variable. They can access and modify instance variable and are called on instances of a class. So one thing to remember that they are called on object, and whatever variable which are instance or which are specific to an object can be accessed and modified inside this method. Let's see an example. Here we have a class rectangle and inside that we have an init method which we use to declare the attributes which are unique to the object, and then we have a method area and inside that we have a self. Now self here denotes the object or instance. So therefore this area method is an instance method because this will be called on object or instance, right? So for example, here we have created an object rectangle, which is actually an object of class rectangle, and inside that I need to pass length and width. So my length is 4 and my width is 6. Whenever I will call the method area using rectangle object, my output will be 24. Now let's understand what's a class method. Class method are used with the @class method decorator. So first thing to remember, so they operate on class variable and are bound to the class rather than the instances. They are typically used for tasks related to the class itself. So class method, as the name suggests, are used within the class and are bound to the class rather than the object. And for that, we will be using the decorator class method before defining it. And also inside the parenthesis, we need to pass CLS, which denote that this method is for the class and not particularly for the instance. So for example, I have a variable pi, which is also a class variable, and whatever method will use my class variable, it will be termed as a class method. And to tell this to my computer, I need to use a decorator, which is a class method. Now, whenever I will print the getPy method, instead of object, I can also use class to call it, right? And the output will be the same. Now, let's understand what's the static method. Now, class method uses the class object. Similarly, instance method uses the instance object. So static method are defined with the decorator static method, and they do not operate on instance variable or class variable. They are not bound to either instances or classes, and they are independent utility method within a class. So for this, we need to use a decorator static method, and inside the method, whatever parameters I am using or whatever variable I am using, they are neither instance nor class variable. So that's all about the type of methods. So now let's revise what all we learned in this video. What is OOP? So OOP is an object-oriented programming that uses objects and classes and perform real-world scenarios like polymorphism, encapsulation, etc. And what's a class? Class is a blueprint of object. What is an object? It's a real entity that has attribute and behavior. Attribute means variable and behavior means function or method in OOP. Then we see an example of class and object, how to create a class, how to create an object of that class, how to access method using the object of a class, right? Then we saw what is an init method. So it is used or called automatically, and it is used to initialize the variables for the attributes of object. Now what's a self parameter? It is a convention that is used to denote an object for which a method has been called. Then we saw different kind of variable like instance and class, and then the different type of method like instance, class, and static. So that's all in this video. Thank you.